We all love a well-placed dirty word. Quick story that will illustrate a lot about me as a person and an opinion on one of the appropriate uses of the dirtiest of all dirty words. You know the one I'm talking about. Some time ago, my husband Rob and I were in our garage, and he was repeatedly telling me to be careful, to which I replied, "Honey, from now on, let's just pretend that I'm not trying to hurt myself. Stop telling me to be careful." I turned around and I immediately tripped over a bucket, sending it flying and me scrambling on my feet in a frenzy. That's when I said it. I took a moment of silence and I looked at him and said, "Don't say anything." He joked, "Well, at least it wasn't the bucket." Now, we all know what he meant because "kicked the bucket" is a phrase that we're all comfortable using to avoid saying died. Society likes to avoid the literal words death, dying, and died, much like some of us avoid using curse words. But we give words power, and the way in which we speak about something carries weight, not only for ourselves, but for the people that we love. After reflecting on my 15 years as a nurse, the last 8 of them in hospice care, I've realized that it's not that people refuse to talk about death and grief, it's that a lot of people just don't know how. And you know what? I want everyone to know that it's not their fault. Because our society has had this cloak of silence and sadness, we have a lack of direction on how to approach death and grief, to the point that we are largely uncomfortable with our own mortality. This in turn creates a culture that treats talking about death and grief as if it's dirty. Think about this with me for a second. People will openly discuss and debate things like abortion, the death penalty, legalizing medical aid in dying. They're comfortable with the language, and in some cases have even been taught to be well-versed on their side of the debate because it's an acceptable topic. We are content to make decisions for others' death, but when it comes to our own mortality, we get a little squeamish. In a lot of cases, we aren't taught a whole lot about death. It's like the topic itself is culturally inappropriate, morbid, or taboo. We use euphemisms to soften the blow of those dreaded D words. Passed away, went to heaven. But on the flip side of that, phrases like "I almost died of embarrassment" or "this is to die for" are pretty common. So let's explore that further. My very first source of inspiration to talk about death and grief, and I mean the most obvious one, is stand-up comedy. I'm dead serious. It's called dark humor, right? Some people are so comfortable, cavalier even, with the language of death and grief. That's one end of the spectrum, stand-up comedians and death professionals. For the rest of us, there's certainly more documentaries, books, movies, games, songs, podcasts, episodes, even entire series, and yes, stand-up comedians and TEDx talks that feature death and grief than ever before. These are some great starting points to utilize. The authors of some of those, I could almost guarantee, are coping through their creations. I could also tell you a couple stories from my years as a nurse, one that involved adult siblings physically fighting in a hospital waiting room. Those stories are effective, but instead, I wanted to tap into my personal experience losing a member of my household. This is the first time I've publicly described Kenny in that way, a member of my household, but that's what he was. Up until last fall, I struggled with finding those words. I couldn't just say that he was my cousin. Not everyone grows up with cousins like I did, as closely as we were. Kenny was more like another brother to me than a cousin. I couldn't say he was one of my best friends because it just didn't feel like enough. And roommate felt like it was on the right track, but still seemed like a demotion somehow. So as this last anniversary of Kenny's death came and went, I found myself explaining to Rob that after 11 years, I can still be surprised by grief. There was a naive expectation that the waves of grief would stop someday, but of course I'm realizing that they never will. That's when he said, "Kenny was a member of your household. After he died, he was still everywhere for you for a long time." And it hit me. He was right. I hate to admit that, especially in public, but my husband was right. I couldn't be in the bathroom of my own home without being reminded of what was lost. One of the most difficult tasks I did was throw away Kenny's toothbrush. There was no escape, no break from the knowledge that he was gone and the feelings that crushed me. At 25 years old, Kenny died 1 week after a car accident that occurred on the night of his brother's wedding. He was and always will be our family's best man. At the time of Kenny's death, I was working as an ICU nurse. I had witnessed countless last breaths and last beats, and while those were certainly heart-wrenching, they weren't my people. At 28 years old, someone that important to me, a member of my household, died, and I had absolutely no idea how to cope, let alone talk about it. I'm not under the delusion that conversations will make traumatic moments like that softer, or that we can completely avoid accidents, period. It's the world we live in. But what I am saying is that we can learn to better talk about death and grief, and in turn normalize talking about an already normal phenomenon. We can feel more confident in how to respond and support someone who's deeply grieving because we have more context. I'm here to encourage you and everyone else out there in classrooms and community groups to start to treat their own mortality as a subject worth exploring instead of one to be censored. Death is the condition of life, and it's the one thing that every single one of us has in common. Grief is a normal experience, and might I add, not explicitly human. It can be incredibly complicated. The only way to make it less awkward and weaken the entirely negative connotation of death and grief is to try to talk about it. Be brave enough to start, engage in a conversation with someone somewhere that you feel comfortable with. I'm aware that death as a subject of conversation is not a natural conversation starter. Believe me, I have tried. But I'm also speaking from lived experience, personally and professionally, that when death as a subject of conversation gets ignored, put off, or just continuously slips through the cracks of life, it will eventually catch you off guard. I was and still am shaken by the loss of Kenny. At this point, I've had over 11 years of getting used to that grief just kind of hanging around. Now I think of it like that unwanted guest that won't stop talking and just leave. Like we've gone past that stereotypical but realistic Midwestern goodbye. In the beginning, I could barely push that guest aside long enough to function. Everything was overshadowed by Kenny not being there. I was angry. I was more fatigued than I had ever been. I took some time off work because I didn't feel like I could do my job safely, and I almost gave up my career as a nurse entirely. Shout out to Sherry Thompson and Dina Sievert for helping me along the way in that journey. This added some financial worry. We don't think about that side of grief often, the practical side, those tasks that are so difficult but need done, like that damn toothbrush I struggled to toss out. Rob did everything he could to support me, of course, but he hadn't known Kenny that long. My family were all dealing with grief in their own ways, and I didn't want to burden them further. I started to feel ashamed, like I was grieving wrong, or it was taking me too long to function again fully. I was given information that a local hospice had free bereavement support. I had one-on-one counseling for a few weeks, and it was tremendously helpful. A trained professional, shout out to Mo, who I had never met and wasn't a part of the circumstances surrounding this tragedy in my life, allowed me to ugly cry and word vomit and just fall apart in front of her. She made it safe and validated that what was happening to me physically, psychologically, spiritually, and practically was all normal, because it was. She also didn't coddle me. She gave me positive outlets and ideas for my emotions. Grief is so personal, so individualized, and it does not have space to be judged. Having access to that type of support may have saved my life, and I now very passionately work for that hospice. Once I was seeking help processing my grief, I was able to start functioning again in the world. That's when I realized I was a part of this club that I never asked to join and had the worst membership requirements. As people started to learn more about Kenny's death, I was surprised by the number of people who had experienced deep grief as I had, even people I had known. It's like they only talked about it with me once it happened to me. I wish I had known more, because knowledge is power and a dash of control. Like I've said, death and grief are deeply personal, psychological, emotional topics, but they can be religious, spiritual, ethical, and even medical topics, and they can really be difficult to initiate. I'd also like to point out that they're cross-cultural. Talking about these things related to our own mortality and that of our loved ones is a really unique conversation. We can talk about death and grief in a range of environments, and I've had some enlightening chats about life in all of them. Among very few close friends, in large groups of strangers, it can be a casual, spontaneous setting, or have a more formal, planned setup, like using a game or attending a death cafe. Seriously, those are things. There's been over 200 death cafes held to date in this country. The idea is to get together over a meal and discuss topics related to death and grief in a safe space free of judgment and expectations. A facilitator uses conversation prompts to initiate and guide conversation amongst the group. I'm currently doing something just like that, utilizing a card game in a group setting. I've had groups as small as 4, and I've had groups as large as 35 at places like senior centers, community centers, YMCAs, libraries. The feedback thus far has been glowingly positive. I've had individuals of all ages, backgrounds, and life experiences in these groups. Some are very chatty, some don't say a word, but approach me afterwards and express their appreciation for the opportunity to listen. Some share deeply personal things that they say they've never shared before. Some cry, most of them laugh, but in the end, almost all of them say they want to continue this conversation. Rob asks me what we talk about, and my answer is life, death, and pizza. We talk about, is it appropriate to take photos at funerals? What constitutes a miracle? How do you fill out a living will? Do people really have deathbed visions? Or what's your best celebrity encounter? And those two are not related. We talk about mediums and grief and vacation spots and so much more. I can tell you a few specific benefits of exploring your own mortality. One big change that I noticed was, I'm what you call a sentimental hoarder. If my kid half-ass painted it and gave it to me with the impression that it was a masterpiece, I'm keeping it. And then I have a really hard time throwing it away. I have pared down boxes of greeting cards and school papers and postcards. Do people do that anymore? I love them. But anything that was handwritten. Now I notice that I look at these things and I really consider, does this mean anything to anyone other than me? What am I gonna do with it? When my kids are older, will they even know what this object or masterpiece is or who that postcard is from? So I really reflect on if something is worth saving or storing. I try to hold my kids longer and I truly sweat the small stuff less. I think I've learned to really value the present moment as well, which, by the way, this one's pretty awesome. What I've noticed is that contemplating my own mortality and the mortality of those that I love is a protective measure too. Because of what I went through being absolutely clueless, and because of the countless other stories that I hear of people who could have really benefited from a proactive conversation. Before Kenny died, I never imagined it as a possibility, but of course it was. Death knows no bias. But through all of this, I've started to view death and grief through more of a lens of hope. I hope that I can help others by focusing on opportunities to explain and explore how facing their mortality can be an uplifting and positive experience. There are many other death professionals out there like me, encouraging, facilitating, and having quality conversations and getting people familiar with the language of death and grief. We're out there. One day we all will die. Why not ask meaningful questions and search for meaningful answers to gain some clarity and maybe even some potential peace? I challenge everyone to start taking back the power, reversing the stigma of these topics. Start or join a conversation in a way that is comfortable for you. Use this talk as a prompt to talk to 1, 2, or 12 people, or use one of those other sources I've mentioned before. Ask people their experiences, if any, with grief and death. In turn, we can better support each other in times of inevitable hardship, and maybe even start to frame death and grief in a way that isn't predominantly macabre. Rip that cloak of silence off, because conversations about death and grief are at their core chats about life, and those can be so fun and interesting and enlightening and even productive. I promise you, talking about it will not jinx you. If it did, I would have already kicked that one bucket that we all know my husband was referring to. Thank you.